So after the Berlin airlift, so the Soviet Union really like definitely starts taking back or controlling what's happening in Eastern Europe. So it becomes this imaginary line that we call the Iron Curtain. Actually, Winston Churchill refers to it as the Iron Curtain, and it separates the Soviet controlled Eastern Europe from the democracies of the Western part of Europe. He said in a speech in Ohio, from the Setland to the Balkans to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent, behind the lines of the ancient capitals of Central and Eastern Europe. So basically, all of this in the red becomes the Soviet Union or Soviet Union controlled area. Now, Harry Truman and the United States are going to use this term, they called it a containment policy. And what they said is that they were basically whatever they had to do to keep the Soviet Union from expanding to other countries. So to continue to keep other countries from becoming communist. He said, with patient but firm, vigilant containment, the US would halt Soviet expansion. So this is known as the Truman Doctrine. And it becomes the official policy of the United States through the Cold War. And they're going to use this Truman Doctrine to basically um, keep doing whatever they have to do to keep the Soviet Union or keep communism contained, and so no other country falls to communism. So they're going to like provide $400 million to help Greece and Turkey to resist communism. And basically, for the United States, anything that wasn't democratic or how they saw democracy, they considered communism. The United States is going to funnel over $12.5 billion to nations in Western Europe under what they called the Marshall Plan. And that was money given to countries so that they could rebuild from all of the devastation and everything from World War II. What that also did, though, is that increases how America was involved in economic and political influence in Western Europe. The idea was they were going to stop the spread of communism in Europe. Um, a British politician said the Marshall Plan was a lifeline to a sinking man. We grabbed the lifeline with both hands. The idea was if they hadn't done this, if the United States had not provided this money to the rest, to Europe, to Great Britain, to France, to Italy, that they would have very quickly become more communist. Eventually, the United States and other countries formed what they call the North Atlantic Treaty Organization of 1949. US, Britain, France, Belgium, Luxembourg, NATO, and NATO still exists today. This is a huge change because before World War II, the United States didn't want any sort of alliances with Europe, right? They were very much isolationists. They're like, nope, you guys keep your stuff over there. We're going to do our stuff over here. But what this does, NATO, it basically puts the United States right in the middle of what's happening in Europe. And it gives the United States a lot more power and control over that. The parties of NATO agreed that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against all of them. Consequently, they agree that if such an armed attack occurs, each of them, in exercise of the right to individual or collective self-defense, will assist the party or parties being attacked, individually and in concert with the other parties. Such action as it deems necessary included the use of armed force to restore and maintain the security of the North Atlantic area. Basically, it says if somebody attacks one of us, they're attacking all of us. Barack Obama actually said NATO is the most important alliance in the history of the world. It's pretty deep. Now, the Soviet Union also creates its own pact, and they have the Warsaw Pact, and that consists of the USSR, Armenia, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, Romania. Now, keep in mind, a lot of those countries didn't actually have a choice whether or not they were going to join, because at that point they're satellite nations. So the USSR is really actually controlling them. This Cold War, this idea that these two countries are in hostility with one another, will last for 45 years. Now, the reason why we call it a Cold War is because technically the United States and the USSR never declare war on one another. That does not mean that there is not fighting, and it doesn't mean there aren't deaths because of this Cold War. So one of the places that we're going to look at is these tensions between the Cold War and between the USS and or the US and the USSR will create proxy wars. It will also create an arms race, meaning they're going to be building up their weapons and leading people into space. The reason they went to space is not because they're like, we must explore the vastness of space, because they were like, where can we put more weapons? Now, the USS or the US comes out of World War II as like, they're the guys with the big gun. What they had was a big bomb, the atomic bomb. Now, remember, the United States only had two of them. They dropped both of them, but now they knew how to make them, and so they started making them. The Soviet Union had spies in the Manhattan Project. They already knew how to make them, so they started making them too. 1949 is when the Soviets test their first atomic bomb. A Dr. Bainbridge, who is one of the atomic scientists, he says when the USSR had the bomb, he said, "Now we are all sons of bitches." Basically, he's saying now both sides can destroy the world. The USSR will be turning out long-range missiles like sausages. That's from Nikita Khrushchev. He becomes the prime minister of the USSR, and he's like, yeah, now we know how to make them. We're going to make lots and lots of them. By 1953, both US and the USSR had started to build hydrogen bombs, which were even more powerful than atom bombs. So they were 450 times more powerful than the bombs dropped in Hiroshima. What this does is both countries start an arms race. They start just building up their armaments and their militaries because they're afraid of one country using these atomic weapons and creating like nuclear Armageddon all through the Cold War. That's what is being, that's the big fear. So for every time the USSR built a new weapon, the United States would build a new weapon. And this just went over and over and over and over again. So we can see the power of these bonds. It said with both nuclear arsenals, they could have really blown up the planet 300 times over. I would think like the first time you blew it up would be enough, but they kept going. Now, these proxy wars are going to be fought. And they basically are, it's the United States and Russia fighting against each other, but not directly. So they're going through like a third country. And the first time this is going to happen is going to be in Korea. From 1950 to 1953, the Korean War is going to represent the very first major proxy war of the Cold War. So this limited war involved either the US or the USSR. It was limited to, it's conventional, meaning they're not using nuclear weapons, and it's going to be in one region, not either the US or the USSR, in this case, North Korea and South Korea. So when the war is over, basically China was here involved in North Korea. Remember, Korea had been controlled by Japan. They had conquered Japan. When Japan is forced to surrender, they give up Korea. Well, North Korea wants to be communist. South Korea is under US control, and they're staying democratic. North Korea in 1950 invades quite suddenly South Korea. The government of North Korea comes in and invades South Korea. And it was surprise, and it was bloody, and it was basically, we're taking over this whole area. South Korea asks for help. They say, please help us. They were members of the newly formed United Nations. And so 16 members of the United Nations, which is under, of course, the US leadership, says, hey, we will help South Korea. Now, the USSR actually sends help, but they don't send any troops. Okay. China, however, was like, okay, we got your back. Literally, we have this other side of you, North Korea. Now, the UN pushes, these UN troops push the North Korean troops across back the 38th parallel. The 38th parallel had been basically the border between the two countries. And then they kept going north, right? So basically, they're able to take back up to this 38th parallel, and then they start moving more north. Well, what big giant country is more north? China. China was like, oh, no, 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 that's not going to happen. So the Chinese offer support, and they're able to push back the troops to the 38th parallel. Now, so this happens 1953 is basically they said, okay, we're going to stop fighting, you stop fighting. They don't actually declare an end to this conflict until recently. But so North Korea would not have been, North Korea basically would have been totally taken over if it hadn't been for the Chinese helping them. All right. Now, in American history, this is a really interesting thing that happens because during this, basically the general had been pushing up. His name is Douglas MacArthur. He had been pushing up into this. He wanted to go all the way to China, and he had said even when the Chinese started pushing back that we should use nuclear weapons. Harry Truman actually fires him and says, no, we will not get into a nuclear conflict with China, because in that case, if they had gone to a nuclear conflict with China, it would have brought in Russia. So if you go to South Korea, you can walk actually between, this is where the demilitarized zone is. This is an area, we call it no man's land, between North Korea and South Korea. It still exists today. Now, North Korea is still considered communist, but they're really more of a totalitarian state being controlled by Kim Jong-il. So this is the first proxy war. Now for Americans, this is really kind of the first time they don't have that complete victory that they had with World War I and World War II. What they have is basically a stalemate, basically saying, okay, we'll stop here, you stop there. Because again, had they pushed further into North Korea, China was already involved. China would have become more involved, and that would have brought in Russia. That could have taken our Cold War to a hot war.